The Rio+20 conference has already been dubbed embarrassing and meaningless by environmentalists. But might multinational corporations have found it hugely rewarding? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The World Wildlife Fund called the Rio Summit a colossal failure of leadership and vision. UN Chief Ban Ki-moon once again affirmed that, quote, time is not on our side, end quote, to take decisive action. But his words have failed to translate into a renewed push to avoid environmental catastrophe. On Friday, the 191 UN delegates, including 86 world leaders, will rubber stamp a more than 50-page draft agreement that essentially provides no new commitments to fight climate change. All this as world temperatures and pollution have risen significantly in the last 20 years, the world's rainforests have shrunk, and the first effects of climate change have become clearer. The Rio+20 conference is a follow-up to the 1992 Earth Summit in the same city, when world leaders did discuss ambitious and legally binding conventions. This time around, the leaders of the United States, Britain and Germany snubbed the summit. In contrast, multinational corporations are well represented at the conference, leading some to wonder whether in the push to attract so-called corporate stakeholders to the environmental cause, the UN summit has become less about the future of the planet than of future corporate profits. All this while crucial areas of habitat like the Amazon are under threat. Here's Al Jazeera's Gabriel Elizondo.
This is what's at stake when people talk about sustainable development. We're here in the Amazon, in a tributary that sits right off the mighty Amazon River. It took us 2 days to get here, but you can see what a spectacular place that it is. Now, a few statistics about the Amazon. It sits in 9 different countries in South America. Nearly half of the South American continent is covered by some part of the Amazon rainforest. Now, the Amazon River, 20% of the Earth's potable water can be found there. And in Brazil alone, 1.5 million plant species in the Amazon. But it's not only plants and animals. 20 million Brazilians call the Amazon region home. But here's the bad news. Since 1970, 600,000 square kilometers, or 230,000 square miles of the Amazon have been lost to deforestation. In a 4-year period alone, earlier this decade, Brazil alone lost a size of the Amazon equal to that of the country of Greece. There is some good news out of all of this. Since 2004, the rates of deforestation here in Brazil have gone down, but with nearly 25% of the Amazon already lost, many people are saying maybe the damage has already been done.
A little earlier, I spoke to Kumi Naidoo. He's International Executive Director for Greenpeace. He says the outcome of this conference is a declaration of war and that the only recourse now is direct action.
Well, it's not so much the process itself that is broken, but it's the political will of the most dominant nations at these negotiations. And what we have is a serious problem of cognitive dissonance, where all the facts are there. Governments know they have to act with ambition and urgency, and in your one-to-one conversations with people, they acknowledge it, but actually when they come together, they prioritize national interests and national parochialism, and we end up, as we have, with the lowest common denominator of agreements, which is just insufficient to avert catastrophic climate change and address the other issues that this conference was seeking to.
Hasn't that been pretty obvious for many years now, though? Why now? Why only now has Greenpeace decided enough is enough?
Well, now we have to recognize that we're in a situation that time is fast running out. The climate science is clear. Emissions should peak by 2015 and start coming down. We know that that's not a possibility right now, and governments have done nothing to actually advance and accelerate progress.
So as we briefly look back then at lessons to be learned, do you think perhaps Greenpeace and other organizations were giving that economic system a fig leaf of respectability, even though they had, I mean, it was simply incompatible with everything that they believed in? Do you think it was a mistake all these years to go to these ever widening summits and so forth?
Well, you know, good activism is not projecting on the world the consciousness or your sense of views and so on. It's starting where the reality of the world is. Whether we like it or not, big global business, including the most polluting corporations of the world, do have hegemony, do have domination, and to a large extent do own our governments. I mean, even if you look at the United States, today the United States can be described as the best democracy money can buy. You know, you can see, in fact, the domination of political decisions, therefore the policies that emerge from governments, is a disproportionate level of voice and influence of governments, and we are now, quite correctly, taking the reality on the ground and challenging that moving forward. Perhaps we have not done it sufficiently in the past, but we certainly will be doing that more and more moving into the future.
So what's being achieved at the Rio summit? To discuss this, we're joined by Rick Piltz. He's founder and director of Climate Science Watch, which is part of the Government Accountability Project that aims to give protection to whistleblowers. He's a former senior associate in the US Climate Change Science Program, and in 2005 he resigned over political interference in that program's climate change reports. We're joined from Rio by Nnimmo Bassey, Executive Director of Environmental Rights Action in Nigeria and Chair of Friends of the Earth International. And also in the studio is Daniel Morris, a fellow at the Washington-based think tank Resources for the Future. Nnimmo Bassey, there's consensus then about the inadequacy of this particular meeting, but is this a problem of the summit? Is it a problem of specific economic and political issues, or is it frankly a problem of the entire framework within which this issue is being discussed?
I think it's a mix of everything. Principally, the delegations, the politicians who are here are playing the script of big business. And this has been so scripted over the past 20 years to ensure that real action is not taken on any of the fronts of the multiple crises that the world is confronted with. They've made sure that real action is not taken on climate change. They make sure that rich government, polluting government countries and polluting industries are not held to account for their pollution. And so coming to Rio in 2012, rather than looking at what was agreed in 1992 and checking the direction of movement of things in the world, we've seen the delegations coming out with a zero draft that is not holding anything, any kind of hope for a right direction to be taken in the future. So we have very clearly seen very deep background moves by corporations and of course by politicians who depend on these corporations for their elections. So it looks like a question of rub my back, I rub your back.
All right, and what's so interesting about that is Friends of the Earth has recently come out with a report analysing the United Nations role, actually, in all of this. The report was entitled Reclaim the UN from Corporate Capture. And it argues that the UN itself has surrendered to a framework that prioritises the interests of multinational corporations. For example, it says the UN now focuses on a green economy as opposed to sustainable development. Now, a green economy is a market-based approach largely drawn up, according to Friends of the Earth, by an investment banker who was on sabbatical from Deutsche Bank at the time. The underlying principle is that nature can be measured and valued according to the services it provides. Thus, nature's services are given a price and can be offset and traded on markets via credits. It's all similar to the carbon trading systems already in practice that were meant to limit carbon emissions but have mainly made massive profits for some companies. Major multinationals now have a key role, according to Friends of the Earth, in drawing up UN policy and often are the main sources of funding for UN agencies. And there's a revolving door between corporations, their lobbies, and the UN. Rick Piltz, what is one to make of this entire framework that the UN is setting up as the forum in which to discuss future progress on climate change?
It appears to be another aspect of corporate globalization, which has been underway for some time. I mean, capitalism pushes for growth and for profit, and the climate change, whether you're talking about the energy system that is driving human-caused climate change, or now moving into dealing with the impacts of climate change. Corporate power sees this as a business opportunity, a revenue stream, you know, a profit center. So I think that it's not surprising, although it's well documented in the Friends of the Earth report, to see the corporate influence. I look at climate change primarily, and I see climate change in the global context as part of the problem of equitable, sustainable development. Climate change is a huge stressor on top of a planet that is already highly stressed. But the most vulnerable populations in the world are not necessarily of interest to the profit-making entities. How are their needs going to be met if the profit-making entities capture the international institutions?
Right, so like Daniel Morris, I suppose what the UN was apparently trying to do, though, was to try and get multinationals involved and corporate and market forces involved. I suppose the other thing that's happened since Rio 20 years ago is this phenomenon of everyone wanting corporations, transnational corporations, the market to take the lead as opposed to government. So I guess this is what they were trying to do. But when you look at that, I mean, effectively what they're saying when it comes to biodiversity is, all right, well, since everything has its own value, if you ruin one part of biodiversity, well, you can probably make up for it by respecting or helping another part of biodiversity. I mean, this is nonsense, surely.
Well, it's not that simple. Honestly, it's not that simple. And I think the system that the UN is supporting and the UN is talking about here at Rio, and as they've talked about for years in the separate climate change negotiations with the Conference of the Parties at Copenhagen and things like that, was that, yes, nature has a value, and it is currently completely outside the economic system that the world runs on. So if we want to try to protect resources, if we want to try to protect the environment, there is value in putting a price on it so that it can be incorporated in the way governments make decisions, in the way corporations make decisions, in the way individuals make decisions. By putting a price on it, you can influence behavior, and you're also saying that we care about this, and you can influence behavior to try and change that.
Nnimmo Bassey, then, when you're at Rio, how do we see these concepts actually play out in real time? I know you've been talking about how, for example, the value of pollinators and things like this. I mean, give us a sense of the actual discussions that are taking place that some might find rather surprising.
Yeah, this is one thing that we notice in the Rio outcome, because the details about the green economy is not really spelled out. So it's going to be an open playing field for industry and for those who back them. You know, it all comes up from what we've seen in the climate negotiations about offsetting, which means that certain industries can keep on polluting, releasing carbon and greenhouse gases to the atmosphere in the rich countries, and then they would make a show of protecting a forest somewhere in Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia, and the whole idea would be that the pollution is being offset by forests somewhere else, so that they avoid responsibility and avoid taking action at source. Now, with regard to the green economy, of course, the third pillar of sustainability is being elongated beyond the social and the environmental pillars. And this is carrying on with the same, you know, policy or the direction of putting a price on everything and pretending to take action whereas there's no action. And so trying to measure environmental services is very difficult, and it's a concept that is driven by speculation. And speculation is what has driven the world into the crisis we're facing now. Speculation in food, speculations over resources.
But what about pollinators? I hate to come back to this, but it just seems so real. That, I mean, are we looking at speculation in pollinators?
Yes. Yes, the pollinators, you know, we do know that insects and birds pollinate plants, moving pollen grains from one flower to the next, from one plant, you know, to another one. And if you read the UNEP background documents on the green economy, you find that one of the case studies is that they put a price tag of $190 billion US on the value of pollination every year. And this is very troubling because...
And how is that split between flowers and bees and...
You know, when a bee or a butterfly pollinates a flower, it doesn't issue an invoice. So this is how much what I've done is what. So this is clearly very dangerous way to view things in nature.
I mean, you do begin to wonder then. I mean, actually, it's interesting because Daniel Morris, your own think tank, and and it has now become, it's not necessarily a bipartisan thing, I mean, not necessarily a partisan thing, it has become the dominant ideology that the market perhaps will be the way out of this. So, for example, RFF Resources, you have Joe Stieglitz and you have all these great liberal scions, but you also have Rio Tinto and ConocoPhillips on your board of directors as well. Do you really think that way salvation lies? Is there any evidence whatsoever, certainly over the last 20 years, of using this kind of market-based model, that this is going in the right direction?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are a number of examples that have been provided. Here in the U.S., for example, the trading program established in the Northeast to reduce SO2 emissions that were resulting in, coming from coal plants spreading across the Northeast, resulting in acid rain, air pollution, local air pollution. The EPA said that we need to reduce these pollutants. They established a trading program that resulted in great success of reducing those pollutants. Those pollutants have been reduced pretty substantially. Another good example is looking at wetland banking, for example, here in the U.S. That is taking a natural resource that is going to be developed sooner or later. I mean, market forces are such that these things will probably be developed unless you just put a big fence around them, which isn't always easy to do. But with wetland banking, you are making the developer responsible for that wetland or that piece of land, and you say, you have to replace this. Is it perfect? No, it's not. But the other solution
banking,
is...
the banking doesn't mean the banks of the wetland. It means it's
no,
a banking model.
I mean, essentially what it's doing is if I'm a developer and I want to develop on the coast because I can make a lot of money doing that, I have a responsibility to not only replace that wetland that I'm taking away somewhere else, but then also to create more and put that in a bank. And that can be, then I'm taking responsibility for the actions.
Rick Piltz, I mean, can you see some potential at all in these market-based solutions, or is actually the problem the market itself in the first place?
Well, I mean, we have the system of market capitalism, but within that, if there's the role for the market seems to me to be in the area of allocating resources efficiently, but according to what criteria? And here I think it's really important that public policy, democratically arrived at public policy, be in the driver's seat. Setting the goals, setting the limits, and then within that, let market forces solve problems with buyout. But if you have corporate,
I mean, according to
but if you have corporate
reports,
power dominating government decision making, and in the U.S. clearly with climate change, but across a wide range of other things, financial policy, health policy, you see the federal government will only make policy up to the limit of what's acceptable to corporate power, and they won't fundamentally challenge that. And so the government becomes kind of like secondary or middle management to corporate power, then you've gone way beyond just the efficiency of the marketplace to something that's much more political.
Nnimmo Bassey, I mean, you're at Rio. How do you see that relationship between corporate power and government power being played out as these discussions on such a crucial issue are taking place?
I would say that corporate power is overwhelming, and this is why it's very essential to break that power, to make, if they claim to be corporate citizens, then they have to take their place as citizens and not dominate political structures, because clearly, when we look at the economic aspect of the green economy being so predominant, and looking at the documents that the governments are about to rubber stamp by tomorrow, we see clearly that a lot of loopholes have been left in that document. Many things that ought to be said clearly are not being said. There are many things about, we talk about energy efficiency or replacing the current fossil-driven civilization. We are not clearly stating what this would be. And so we're suspecting, we can only suspect at this time, that there's going to be unregulated technologies unleashed on an unsuspecting world. For example, there's already worries about what is coming up to synthetic biology, which could be used to develop fuels. And even when you talk about new energy efficiency technologies, we should be talking really about reducing consumption. And this is going to, as we can be as efficient as we want to be. But if that efficiency does not reduce consumption, you're going to put more pressure on the poor, vulnerable, weak communities of the global poor. is now a big challenge between the global rich and the global poor. That is the challenge we're facing now.
Daniel Morris, I mean, that's the point. I mean, the Canadian author Naomi Klein wrote an article recently where she said actually there is an inconvenient truth that the extreme right is correct, that actually to care about the environment, to look for a sustainable future is incompatible with global capitalism, as they were always warning, that they always warned this as a left-wing plot. You do have to overturn what are called free market principles. You have to move to central planning. You have to have regulation. You have to have government investment. You have to have equitable distribution and taxation and all these things, which,
right.
of course, anathema to the modern economic system espoused by both Democrats and Republicans.
It's not an anathema because there's regulation in market systems all over the place. I mean, there's no such thing as a free market in existence in the world because government is an actor in all markets. It regulates. It's its job to regulate, right? And so this is just another extension of showing that markets can work in concert with public policy, right? The idea is not to just put a price on carbon and let corporations and other actors run wild and just do what they want, right? This is a way to, like you said, Rick, efficiently allocate resources in a way that's useful. It's a way to reduce
efficiently. What do we mean by efficiently? Efficiently for shareholder value or efficiently for the fundamental problems that the Earth is facing?
Efficiently for the fundamental problems of the Earth. Right now, there is no mechanism by which a corporation can account for their greenhouse gas emissions or their local pollution, except if a government comes in and says, you will be punished for this emission. Now, if there were a price on that, then they could incorporate that into their operations. They could say, this is the damage we are causing, and this is how we can fix it. The price would drive efficiencies. It would drive them to reduce their resource extraction, become more efficient with how they operate. And then, where they have opportunities to reduce and others don't, they can potentially trade those.
We're running out of time. Rick Piltz, does that fill you with hope?
Well, if we had a price on carbon, that would change the market calculation. But the reason we don't in this country is because the fossil energy industry has used its political influence to prevent that kind of policy from being adopted. And,
what about this country then? President Obama isn't in Rio. There have been mutterings and briefings to the press that perhaps in the second term he feels his legacy might be on climate change, but does even talking about it as a second-term issue suggest that he doesn't perhaps get it. And meanwhile, his public pronouncements are very much of the drill baby drill variety. In Rio, his negotiators have reneged on what the first President Bush agreed upon and so forth. I mean, is he completely wedded to this market framework, or do you have any sense of hope?
Yeah, I think he's a Wall Street friendly president. I think as far as climate change, he's not steeped in that issue, not the way Al Gore was or is, Senator Kerry. He doesn't really own it. He has been unable or unwilling to find a way to invest political capital in it, to communicate it effectively to the public, to make something happen. So I don't think it's a fundamental priority for him. I don't expect things to be fundamentally different in a second term.
Nnimmo Bassey, then, we heard from Greenpeace earlier. They're saying, well, look, this entire system of negotiation, even through the UN, who seem to be like the best route, it's just not working. Direct action's the only way. What do you feel? I mean, what are the answers then now?
Well, we have serious issues with the United Nations system, with the multilateral negotiations, because the cynicism of the whole process has come up so clearly with regard to the negotiations on climate change, where rather than making commitments, no matter how minimal they are, countries are pushing for voluntary emission reduction, and then creating what they call a green climate fund without any money in the bank, just making pronouncements that don't have substance. And now we are seeing this being pursued even further. And the solution is very clear. And the solution is when we look at the three pillars of sustainability: the economic prosperity, social justice, and we notice that those three legs, economy, social, they're not enough. You need the political space. We need the political space for people to bring up their voices to be heard. And this is why Friends of the Earth International is placing real emphasis on standing with the people, on articulating voices, the voice of the people, of getting our voices heard. The people have been speaking. It's not that we don't have a voice. The problem is that policymakers are not listening to us because the voices of corporations are just too loud in their ears.
Nnimmo Bassey, thank you very much. Very similar themes that we hear often about the economic sphere and the economic debate right now across the world. Rick Piltz, thank you very much. Daniel Morris, thank you. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.